Hello and welcome to Flick'splained, the channel where we take your favorite series and break them down for you to ensure you don't miss a single detail. Today we are going to be taking another look at Netflix's limited series, Dahmer Monster: The Jeffrey Dahmer Story. Though the series only spanned the length of 10 episodes, there were a lot of chances for you to miss the smaller details. But don't worry, you're in luck, because in today's video, we are going to be talking about our top 10 Easter eggs and hidden details that you might have missed in Netflix's new series. Make sure you stick around until the end to hear about the cameo that was made by another prolific serial killer. The Mannequin. First up today, we are going to talk about the mannequin that we saw in the Netflix series that caused Dahmer and his grandmother to have quite the falling out once Dahmer realized she had thrown it away. This is based on a very real incident that happened, though some of the facts got clouded along the way. In real life, Jeffrey did break into a mall in Milwaukee in the middle of the night and stole a mannequin. He then took that mannequin home with him and stashed it in his room when he wasn't using it to arouse himself. And in the series, we can see Dahmer getting aggressively upset with his grandmother after she discovered the mannequin and threw it into the trash without consulting him first. This is where the details are a bit foggy because according to Dahmer himself, things happened a bit differently. While his grandmother did discover his hidden mannequin, she wasn't the one who threw it in the garbage. Apparently, upon learning that it was discovered, the killer disposed of the mannequin himself for fear that she was going to tell his father about it. Samsak synthesophone. Dahmer ruined the lives of many over the years, but there was one family that was unlucky enough to have not one of its members, but two fall victim to Jeffrey Dahmer. This is hinted at in one of the saddest sequences in the series. On May 26, 1991, Dahmer met a young 14-year-old boy named Konarek Synthesophone. In the series, the killer meets Konarek outside of the liquor store, though in reality they met while Dahmer was looking for his next victim, roaming around a Milwaukee mall. Jeffrey Dahmer offered to pay Konarek to come back to his apartment and take some pictures when, unbeknownst to him, he had already had a run-in with the Synthesophone family. In this series, Konarek can be heard asking Dahmer about an incident that occurred in 1988 where Dahmer was actually charged with molesting and assaulting Konarek's brother Samsak. This is based on a real thing that happened, and Dahmer was actually charged for sexual misconduct. As of right now, Samsak lives a very private life that has undoubtedly been affected by his encounter with Dahmer, followed by the death of his brother Konarek, who was murdered by the same man who assaulted him when he was only 13. There is no evidence, however, that Konarek recognized Dahmer or confronted him about the fact that he knew who the killer was before his death. Dean Vaughn. One of the big mysteries that was sort of overshadowed by the Jeffrey Dahmer case that was briefly embellished in the Netflix series was exactly what happened to Dean Vaughn. In the show, it's clearly indicated that shortly after moving into the Oxford apartments, Dean Vaughn met Dahmer and began spending time with him before becoming his latest victim. While Dean Vaughn was a real person who did get murdered in the Oxford apartments, Dahmer claimed to have not been involved in the murder. And considering how open he was about his other killings once he was incarcerated, many believe him when he says he didn't kill Vaughn. Dean Vaughn was found strangled in his apartment in May of 1991, and both times that Dahmer was questioned about the murder of Vaughn, he denied knowing him. To this day, the murder of Dean remains unsolved and is still technically considered an open case. Infinity Land. Up next, we are going to talk about a game that Dahmer created out of boredom and loneliness when he was only 9 years old. It appeared in the Netflix series when Dahmer attempted to explain the rules and explain to one of his victims, Tony Hughes, how the game is supposed to be played before having an aggressive outburst. Infinity Land is played using stick figures as game pieces to wander the board. If any two pieces were to get too close to one another, however, they are sent into a black hole. The show doesn't go into much detail surrounding the game, and it's currently unknown whether or not he really played it with any of his victims, as shown in the series. His obsession with movies. Next, we have an interesting obsession that Dahmer had that was shown in the limited series. Like most people, Jeffrey Dahmer was a fan of movies. However, there were two movies in particular that he felt drawn to. Those movies were Star Wars Episode 6: Return of the Jedi and The Exorcist 3. He was particularly fond of the villains in these movies and even went as far as wearing yellow contacts so that he could resemble either the Emperor or the Gemini Killer. This was shown in Dahmer on Netflix as the killer forces his victims to sit and watch those movies with him. In interviews, Dahmer admitted to feeling drawn to those characters and claimed that wearing the yellow contacts made him feel powerful like they were.
That I actually derive a sort of pleasure from watching that tape.
Did you like feeling evil?
No, I didn't. But I had tried to overcome the thoughts, and it worked for a while, but eventually I gave in.
During his testimony against the killer, Tracy Edwards testified that while he was forced to watch The Exorcist 3, Jeffrey Dahmer could often be heard humming or chanting periodically during moments of the film.
It was like a slow slur, like some of that nature, some close like that, I'm not sure.
Did it keep on for a period of time?
Off and on throughout the ordeal.
Jeffrey Dahmer may have called the families of his victims. Now let's talk about something that may have happened, though there is no proof that it was actually Jeffrey Dahmer that did it. In the series, we can see the killer making a phone call to Errol Lindsay's family after killing him. Dahmer can be heard telling Errol's sister that her brother had gone into the vortex.
He's gone now. Into the vortex.
While there is no proof that this happened, another family member of a victim of the serial killer did claim to get a similar phone call. A woman named Carolyn Smith received a phone call in 1991 from someone who warned her that she needed to stop looking for her missing brother, Edward Smith, who had disappeared a year before. The caller went even as far as to tell Carolyn that her brother was dead when she asked why she should stop looking for him. Similar calls were placed to the grandparents of Ernest Miller in September of 1990. According to an interview given by Dahmer, he did place phone calls to the families of his victims, though that is the closest thing to proof that exists. None of the calls were actually documented or recorded. He had dedicated fans. Up next, let's talk about a phenomenon that I will never understand, and that's serial killer fan clubs. Don't get me wrong, documentaries and shows following the heinous crimes that these people committed are interesting, but to actively reach out to a serial killer with fan mail is really strange. However, it's a real thing that happens, and it's shown in Dahmer. Throughout various scenes in the Netflix series, Dahmer can be seen looking at fan mail, and even using money that his so-called fans had sent him while he was imprisoned. He would use this money to make his stay in lockup more comfortable for himself. This included spending the fans' money on magazines, comic books, and even cassette tapes of animal noises to help him sleep at night. In the series, they focus briefly on the fact that he purchased a tape of whale noises while in jail, which is only one of many cassettes and reading materials that he acquired through the help of his fans. The accuracy behind the impact statements. One of the most accurate depictions in the show was the victim's impact statements while Dahmer was on trial. Not only was that some of the most intense acting ever to be on screen, but it was also insanely accurate to what happened at the trial in real life. During the trial of Jeffrey Dahmer, the families of the victims were given the opportunity to speak about how what the killer did affected them. Rita Isbell, the sister of Errol Lindsay, delivered one of the most emotional statements ever seen in a courtroom. She stood in front of the court and let everyone, specifically Jeffrey Dahmer, know how much she had hurt her and her family. According to Rita, she let everything out at that moment and made sure that she didn't leave the courtroom feeling like she should have said something differently. Though it was just a reenactment, you can hear all of the pain that she and her family felt at that moment.
Now, I don't want to ever have to see my mother go through this again. Never, Jeffrey! Jeffrey, I hate you!
Jeffrey Dahmer's final statement to the court. In the same line as the last detail, the final statement that the killer gave to the court was also extremely accurate when it was shown in the Netflix series. Again, the acting in this scene is unmatched throughout the rest of the series, and Evan Peters seemed to absolutely embody the serial killer as he gave his final statement. Whether it was from the semi-monotone delivery of his speech or the fact that it depicted the moment that the world knew that they were safe from the wrath of Jeffrey Dahmer, the scene was very powerful and moving. Not because you felt any sympathy for the killer, because that wasn't the point of the series, but because in one of the most accurate reenactments in the history of modern drama, the world got to see one of the most horrific killers in the world get what he deserved. There was no escaping justice for Dahmer, and he knew that when he gave his final statement, and the Netflix series did a really great job at getting that point across.
It is over now. This has never been a case of trying to get free. I didn't ever want freedom. Frankly, I wanted death for myself.
The Killer Clown. Last but not least, let's talk about one of the biggest appearances in the entire series. In the opening scene of the final episode, we got to see a few brief moments of another horrendous killer that wasn't Dahmer. John Wayne Gacy was one of the most notorious serial killers and sex offenders to have ever existed. He was found guilty of murder, torture, and rape of at least 33 young boys. He was known as the Killer Clown because during the day, Gacy would perform at charitable events as a clown named Pogo or Patches. Gacy became known for luring his victims into his home under the guise of teaching them magic tricks or performing for them. But once they were inside, he would trap them and proceed to do truly horrible things. Investigators found 26 of his victims buried inside a crawlspace that was in his basement, along with 3 other bodies on his property. Gacy was convicted and sentenced to death on March 13, 1980, and was executed via lethal injection on May 10, 1994, at Statesville Correctional Center. Oddly enough, it was on that same day that Dahmer chose to get baptized, which was shown in the final episode of the show. The events also lined up with a brief solar eclipse. What was your favorite Easter egg from the Netflix's Dahmer monster, The Jeffrey Dahmer Story? Make sure you let us know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed today's video, be sure to check out our upcoming video discussing the ending of the hit Netflix series and the details surrounding his death.